History often feels like a solid, inevitable story. But what if its greatest turning points balanced on a knife's edge? We are about to examine 25 ancient wars that could have ended differently, where a single choice, a moment of luck, or a different piece of advice changed everything. This is not fantasy. It is a serious look at the fragile nature of our past, revealing how the world you know was built on outcomes that were far from certain. By the end, you will see the forces that truly shape civilizations with a clarity you have never had before. What if a city had ignored a wooden gift, or an emperor had waited just one more day? How many cultures and ideas we take for granted might never have existed? The path of history is a mosaic of near misses. Which ancient crossroads do you think was the most fragile of all? The story of the Trojan War is woven deeply into the fabric of Western legend. For a decade, the assembled might of Greece laid siege to the wealthy, towering walls of Troy, a conflict sparked by a single choice and fought over a single individual. This stalemate, a grinding war of attrition, seemed to have no end in sight. Then, one morning, the Trojans awoke to a shocking sight. The Greek camp was empty. Their ships were gone. All that remained on the shore was a colossal, carefully crafted wooden horse, an offering left behind to the goddess Athena. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare designed to exploit hope and religious devotion. The critical decision now rested entirely with King Priam and his council. Should they destroy this strange artifact or bring it within their impregnable walls as a trophy of their hard-won victory? The priest Laocoon famously urged caution, his warning an eternal echo of distrust. Yet the desire to believe the war was finally over, combined with the clever deception of a Greek agent, swayed the city's leadership. They chose to see the horse as a blessing, not a trap. They breached their own legendary defenses to welcome it inside. That night, the secret compartment opened, and the war ended not with a battle but with a signal fire. But let us pause at that moment of decision on the Trojan plain. What if the warnings had been heeded? Imagine Priam, weathered by 10 long years, looking upon that silent, hollow gift with a king's suspicion instead of a victor's pride. Suppose he had ordered it burned where it stood or cast into the sea. The Greek plan, a final, desperate gamble, would have evaporated. With their ruse exposed, the departing fleet would have had no choice but to truly sail home, their resources and morale shattered. Troy would have endured. The city-state, a crucial hub of trade and culture in the ancient world, would have continued its story, potentially growing into a regional power that reshaped Anatolian history for centuries. The consequences ripple outward in staggering ways. Without the fall of Troy, the epic journeys that define so much of classical mythology might never have begun. There is no long, tragic voyage for Aeneas, no founding myth for what would become Rome. The entire cultural identity of the Roman Empire, which traced its lineage directly back to those Trojan refugees, is cast into doubt. Similarly, the fantastical 10-year odyssey of Odysseus, a tale born from the aftermath of sack and sea, loses its foundational catalyst. The literary and cultural pillars of two civilizations, Greece and Rome, are suddenly built on a different, quieter history. This single choice at the gates did not just decide the fate of one city. It chose between two entirely different worlds, one we know, and one we can only glimpse through the cracks of a story that almost was. The shadow of that Trojan horse stretches far across the centuries, a reminder that the fate of a civilization can pivot on one council's decision. But history's fragile moments are not confined to myth. Move forward several hundred years to the sun-baked plain of Marathon in the year 490 before Common Era. Here, the stakes were just as monumental and the hinge of fate just as delicate. A Persian army of immense size, sent by King Darius to punish Athens for supporting a rebellion, had landed on Greek soil. Facing them was a force of Athenian hoplites, outnumbered by at least 2 to 1, joined only by a small contingent from Plataea. The conventional military wisdom of the era was clear and logical. Heavy infantry, burdened by bronze armor and large shields, should hold a strong defensive position, letting the enemy break against their disciplined ranks. To charge at a run across nearly a mile of open ground was considered tactical madness, a sure way to arrive exhausted and disordered, easy prey for enemy arrows and spears. The Persian commanders expected exactly this defensive posture, a delay they could use to fully deploy their feared cavalry and bring their overwhelming numbers to bear. Yet the Athenian general Miltiades saw a narrow window, a fleeting vulnerability in the Persian formation. In that critical moment, he made a breathtaking gamble. He ordered the Greek line to thin its center and then, against all tradition, to advance at a run. Picture the scene from the Persian perspective. The horizon suddenly churns with dust and the glint of bronze, not a slow, marching wall, but a roaring tide of men sprinting directly at them. This was not part of the plan. The psychological shock was as powerful as the physical one. The Persian archers, trained to shoot at a measured advance, now faced a closing distance that evaporated in moments, their volleys falling short or losing power against the Greeks' final desperate sprint. Most critically, the chaos and speed of this unprecedented charge likely disrupted the Persians' ability to deploy their cavalry effectively, neutralizing one of their greatest advantages before the battle was truly joined. When the lines met, it was the exhausted but adrenaline-fueled Greeks who struck first with shattering force, their long spears driving into the Persian ranks. The flanks of the Greek line rolled forward, encircling the enemy center in a classic maneuver born of sheer momentum. In a matter of hours, the mighty Persian force was routed, fleeing back to their ships. The victory was so complete, so improbable, that a messenger ran the 26 miles to Athens to announce the triumph, a legendary feat that gave its name to the modern race. But let us freeze time at that moment before the run began. What if Miltiades had hesitated? What if the Athenian commanders had listened to the voice of conventional wisdom and held their ground on the slopes, waiting for the Persian assault? A slower advance or a static defense changes everything. It gives the Persian generals the one thing they needed: time. Their cavalry, a mobile and terrifying force, could have been marshaled and launched against the Greek flanks. Their numerical superiority could have been brought to bear, slowly surrounding and wearing down the Athenian line. The likely outcome shifts from a miraculous Greek victory to a decisive Persian one. With the main Athenian army defeated at Marathon, the road to Athens itself would have been undefended. The city would have fallen, its leaders replaced by a puppet regime loyal to Persia. The nascent experiment of Athenian democracy, still fragile and only a few decades old, would have been snuffed out before it could mature. King Darius, having avenged his honor and secured the Aegean coast, would have consolidated control over mainland Greece. The political and cultural trajectory of the entire region bends sharply eastward toward autocracy and imperial tribute. Without a free and confident Athens, the chain reaction of history is broken. The great cultural flourishing of the 5th century, the age of Pericles, of Socrates, of the Parthenon, and the birth of Western philosophy and drama, simply does not happen in the same way, if at all. The model of citizen government that would later inspire nations across millennia might never have been forged. The run at Marathon was more than a tactical innovation. It was a desperate sprint for the future itself, a race against time to preserve an idea that had only just begun to whisper. The desperate sprint at Marathon bought Greece a fragile decade, not a lasting peace. By 480 before Common Era, a new Persian king, Xerxes, assembled a force of unprecedented scale to finish what his father had started. This was not just an army, it was a slow-moving empire on the march, supported by an enormous fleet that shadowed its progress along the coast. The Greek strategy to counter this dual threat was a single, coordinated plan split across two battlefields, one on land and one at sea. On the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae, King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, alongside several thousand allied soldiers, prepared to make their legendary stand. Their goal was simple: to bottle up the massive Persian army in a place where its numbers meant nothing. But their entire position depended entirely on what was happening just a few miles away in the Straits of Artemisium. The Greek fleet, assembled from city-states often at odds with each other, had one critical mission: to hold the Persian navy at bay. If the Persian ships broke through, they could sail behind the Greek lines at Thermopylae, land troops in their rear, and turn the pass into a death trap. The land and sea battles were two halves of a single heartbeat. For 3 days, these twin conflicts raged simultaneously. At Thermopylae, the Greeks used the terrain with brutal efficiency, their longer spears and heavier armor devastating the waves of Persian infantry forced to attack in narrow columns. At Artemisium, the Greek triremes, though outnumbered, fought a series of fierce, chaotic engagements in poor weather, using their superior knowledge of the local waters to prevent a decisive Persian breakthrough. The losses were heavy on both sides, but the Greek line held just barely. The stand at the hot gates became possible only because the fleet at Artemisium did not break. But now, consider the alternative. What if the first major naval clash had gone decisively in Persia's favor? Imagine a clear Greek defeat at Artemisium in the opening days of the campaign. With the sea now belonging to Xerxes, the strategic picture collapses instantly. The Greek commanders at Thermopylae would have received urgent messages: their position is no longer defensible. Persian marines are landing behind you. The only choice is an immediate, panicked retreat to avoid complete annihilation. Leonidas's sacrificial rear-guard action, which bought the alliance crucial time and became a timeless symbol of defiance, never happens because the army is already in full flight. With the pass abandoned, the Persian army marches unimpeded into central Greece. Their fleet, now dominant, can resupply them at will and threaten any coastal city. The united Greek defense, always a fragile coalition, likely shatters. City-states, seeing the hopelessness of resistance, might begin to negotiate terms with Xerxes one by one. The political map of Greece is redrawn by Persian satraps. In this timeline, the unique cultures of Sparta, with its rigid military society, and Athens, on the verge of its democratic golden age, are absorbed into an imperial system. The intense rivalry and creative friction between these two powers, which would define the next century, is smoothed over by foreign rule. The ideas born from Athenian democracy and the martial ethos of Sparta, which so profoundly influenced Western thought, are filtered through a different lens, perhaps never reaching the potency they achieved in our world. The twin battles of 480 were a single gamble, a bet that a thin line of shields and a wall of wooden ships could hold back an ocean. For a few critical days, against all odds, that bet paid off. But it reminds us that the most iconic last stands in history often depend on forgotten battles happening just out of sight, where the tide of an era truly turns. The stand at Thermopylae was a testament to Greek unity against an external foe, but that hard-won alliance was tragically fragile. Within decades, the two greatest powers to emerge from those wars, democratic Athens and militaristic Sparta, turned on each other. The Peloponnesian War became a grinding, 30-year conflict that exhausted the entire Greek world. For a long time, it was a war of attrition, with neither side able to land a decisive blow. Then, in the year 415 before Common Era, Athens saw a chance to shatter the stalemate. Far to the west lay the island of Sicily, wealthy, fertile, and home to the powerful city of Syracuse, a Dorian city and a natural ally of Sparta. Athenian leaders, particularly the ambitious Alcibiades, argued that conquering Sicily would provide immense resources, cut off Spartan grain supplies, and cement Athenian dominance forever. It was a grand, imperial gamble. The assembly voted to send a massive expeditionary force, one of the largest and most expensive ever assembled by a Greek city. The initial campaign went well. Athenian ships and soldiers secured beachheads and won allies. Syracuse was thrown into panic. The moment for a swift, decisive strike was at hand. But here, the story pivots on a single personality. The overall command was shared, and one of the generals, an older, cautious man named Nicias, had opposed the expedition from the start. After some initial successes, instead of pressing the attack against a reeling Syracuse, he hesitated. Fearing the size of the city's walls and the potential for a long siege, Nicias sent a famous letter back to Athens. He did not request permission to withdraw. Instead, he asked for a massive reinforcement of both troops and ships, or, he warned, the entire force would be in grave danger. The Athenian assembly, already committed, doubled down. They sent a second enormous fleet and army, a staggering investment of men and treasure. This delay was catastrophic. It gave Syracuse exactly what it needed: time. The Syracusans, under a shrewd leader named Hermocrates, used the pause to strengthen their defenses, train their forces, and crucially, appeal to Sparta for help. By the time the Second Athenian Armada arrived, Syracuse was no longer a vulnerable target. It was a fortified fortress, and Spartan commanders were on their way to lead its defense. The campaign descended into a brutal two-year siege that ended in utter disaster. Trapped in the city's great harbor, the Athenian fleet was destroyed. On land, the retreating army was cut to pieces. Tens of thousands of Athenian citizens and allies were lost, either in the fighting or in the harsh captivity that followed. The financial and human cost broke the back of Athenian power. So let us rewind to that moment of hesitation. What if a different commander, someone with the daring of an Alcibiades or the resolve of a Spartan king, had been in charge of the initial force? With Syracuse in disarray and its morale low, a rapid, aggressive assault could have overwhelmed the city's incomplete defenses. A swift Athenian victory in Sicily would have been more than a military triumph. It would have been a geopolitical earthquake. The vast agricultural wealth of Sicily would have flowed into Athenian coffers, funding their war effort indefinitely. The psychological blow to Sparta and its allies would have been devastating, proving Athenian reach was limitless. More importantly, it likely would have convinced other neutral or wavering city-states across the Mediterranean that Athens was the inevitable hegemon, bringing them into its orbit. The Peloponnesian War, instead of dragging on for another decade, might have ended with a decisive Athenian peace. The Athenian Empire, rather than collapsing in defeat just a few years later, could have been consolidated and expanded. This changes the entire cultural and political trajectory of the classical world. Without the catastrophic loss in Sicily, the golden age of Athenian democracy, philosophy, and art does not suffer its sudden, premature dimming. Figures like Socrates might have lived out their lives in a confident, victorious Athens, altering the course of his teachings and his eventual trial. The model of democratic imperialism, for all its flaws, becomes the enduring template of the Mediterranean, potentially stifling the later rise of Macedonian power under Philip and Alexander before it even began. The Sicilian expedition was not just a failed campaign. It was a moment where Athenian ambition overreached, yes, but also where a surplus of caution at the critical instant transformed a probable victory into the most famous defeat in ancient history. The fate of an empire and the legacy of a civilization hung on one general's reluctance to press an advantage. The disaster in Sicily did not end the war, only Athenian hope for a quick victory. For another decade, the conflict ground on, a brutal war of nerves and resources. Then, in 406 before Common Era, a flicker of salvation appeared on the horizon. Sparta, with Persian gold funding its fleet, had assembled a massive armada to finally crush Athens at sea. The Athenian response was desperate, scraping together a fleet from its last reserves, manned by inexperienced crews and even slaves who were promised their freedom for victory. The two forces met near the islands of Arginusi, Against all odds, through clever tactics and sheer desperation, the Athenians won a stunning, overwhelming victory. They had shattered the Spartan fleet, saving their city from immediate starvation and collapse. The news should have sparked celebration in the streets of Athens, a moment of renewed hope. Instead, it triggered one of the most self-destructive political acts in history. The problem was not the victory itself, but its cost. In the stormy aftermath of the battle, several Athenian triremes had been disabled or sunk. The victorious admirals, faced with a rising storm and the threat of the remaining Spartan ships, made a fateful choice. They prioritized pursuing the enemy fleet over immediately rescuing the sailors from the wrecked vessels. Many Athenian citizens, free men and slaves alike, were left to drown. When the fleet returned home, the public mood was not one of gratitude but of fury and grief. The families of the lost sailors demanded justice, and the Democratic Assembly, inflamed by skilled orators, put the 6 victorious admirals on trial. Not for losing the battle, but for winning it the wrong way. The legal proceeding was a spectacle of collective anger. Despite eloquent defenses, including from the philosopher Socrates, who happened to be presiding over the assembly that day, the admirals were condemned. All 6 were executed. In a single stroke, Athens voluntarily beheaded its own navy. The men who had just masterminded a miraculous victory against impossible odds, the most experienced and capable commanders the city had left, were gone. The institutional knowledge, the tactical brilliance, the hard-won respect of their crews, all of it was sacrificed on the altar of public emotion. The fleet was handed over to a committee of less capable men, its morale shattered. Now hold that alternative in your mind. What if the assembly, in that heated moment, had listened to the voices of reason? What if they had celebrated the victory, honored the admirals, and launched a swift mission to recover any possible survivors? The commanders of Arginusi would have remained in charge. The Athenian navy, though battered, would have entered the next sailing season led by proven, confident veterans, men who had just outthought and outfought the best Sparta could offer. Their very presence would have been a psychological weapon. When the Spartan commander Lysander moved to the Hellespont the following year to strangle Athens' vital grain route, the Athenian fleet that sailed to meet him at Aegispotami would have been different. It would have been led by admirals who understood discipline, who remembered the lessons of Arginusi, and who commanded the loyalty of their men. The careless routine that led to the actual disaster, where Athenian crews disembarked daily in plain sight of the enemy, might never have developed under stricter, more vigilant leadership. A more cautious, experienced command could have recognized Lysander's trap or forced a battle on more favorable terms. Even a stalemate in the Hellespont would have prolonged the war, giving Athens more time to negotiate or for internal pressures within the Spartan alliance to fracture. The total annihilation of the Athenian fleet, which led directly to the city's unconditional surrender and the end of its empire, might have been averted. The execution after Arginusi was not just a tragic mistake. It was a nation, in its exhaustion and pain, choosing to break its own sword right after it had won its greatest battle. The war was ultimately lost not at Aegispotami, but in the assembly of Athens, in the space between victory and vengeance. The execution of its own admirals left Athens fatally weakened, a self-inflicted wound from which it could not recover. But the currents of history shift, and within a single generation, the center of power moved north to the Kingdom of Macedonia. Here, a young king named Alexander inherited not only his father Philip's superb army, but a burning ambition to cross into Asia and challenge the Persian Empire itself. In the spring of 334 before Common Era, his moment arrived. The Macedonian army crossed the Hellespont and soon faced its first major test on the banks of the Granicus River. The Persians had chosen their ground well, positioning their cavalry on the steep, muddy bank to smash any attempted crossing. Alexander's older, more cautious generals advised waiting until morning, suggesting the Persians might withdraw overnight. The 22-year-old king dismissed the idea instantly. To delay, he declared, would be an admission of fear. He ordered an immediate, direct cavalry charge across the river and up the slippery slope, a tactic that seemed recklessly bold. Leading his elite companion cavalry from the front, Alexander was the spear point of the assault. The fighting was chaotic and brutal at close quarters. In the midst of the melee, a Persian nobleman named Spithridates recognized the Macedonian king by his distinctive plumed helmet and shining armor. Seeing an opportunity to end the war with a single stroke, Spithridates raised his axe and brought it down with all his strength. The blow connected, shearing through Alexander's helmet and into his scalp. At that exact moment, another figure intervened. Alexander's childhood friend and bodyguard, Cleitus, swung his own sword in a desperate arc, severing Spithridates' arm at the shoulder before the Persian could strike a second fatal blow. Alexander, blood streaming down his face, was pulled to safety as the battle raged around him. The Macedonians, fueled by the near loss of their king, fought with renewed fury and eventually secured the bank, leading to a complete victory. But let us freeze that instant on the muddy slope of the Granicus. What if Cleitus had been a half-second slower? What if the axe had fallen just an inch lower or with more force? In that scenario, Alexander the Great dies not as a legendary conqueror, but as an anonymous casualty in the first skirmish of his campaign. The effect would have been instantaneous and catastrophic for the Macedonian army. The invasion was a deeply personal venture, its morale and unity bound entirely to Alexander's charisma and perceived divine favor. His death would have shattered that cohesion. The command structure, rife with older generals who already doubted the young king's aggressive strategy, would have fractured. A frantic retreat back across the Hellespont would have been the only logical move to preserve the army and the Macedonian kingdom itself. The entire grand expedition collapses before it truly begins. The consequence is the preservation of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a state that had ruled from the Aegean to the Indus for 2 centuries. Though it showed signs of internal strain, it remained the world's superpower. Without Alexander's decade-long campaign of conquest, the empire of Darius III continues. The political and cultural landscape of the ancient world solidifies along its existing lines. The great cosmopolitan blending that Alexander forced into being, the Hellenistic world, never emerges. The vibrant fusion of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian ideas that flourished in cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Seleucia does not happen. The Library of Alexandria, a center of global knowledge, is never founded. The widespread dissemination of Greek art, science, and philosophical thought across 3 continents is stillborn. The linguistic and administrative frameworks that later made the rise of Rome easier to manage across the eastern Mediterranean do not develop in the same way. Even the path of world religions shifts as the Greek-influenced environment that later helped shape the context for early philosophical and religious movements, including the spread of new ideas, remains distinctly Persian and Eastern in character. The axe at the Granicus was aimed not just at a man but at the future itself. Its near miss allowed one of history's most consequential stories to be written. Its hit would have closed the book on an era of cultural explosion, leaving us with a quieter, more consolidated, and profoundly different ancient world. The axe that nearly ended Alexander's story at the Granicus was a warning of the physical limits of conquest, but a far more profound limit was waiting for him 8 years and thousands of miles later. By 326 before Common Era, his army stood on the banks of the Hyphosis River, the modern Beas in Punjab. They had crossed the known world from Greece through Persia and Afghanistan, and had just fought a grueling, costly war against King Porus and his war elephants at the Hydaspes. Exhausted but victorious, they looked east. Across the river lay the vast, unknown plains of the Indian subcontinent, and intelligence from local scouts spoke of an empire that dwarfed anything they had yet faced, the Nanda Empire of the Ganges Valley, with armies rumored to be in the hundreds of thousands, including thousands more war elephants. Alexander, his ambition burning brighter than ever, ordered preparations to cross. He spoke of reaching the edge of the world, the Eastern Ocean, but for the first time his army said no. The rank-and-file soldiers, the Macedonian veterans who had followed him to the ends of the earth, held a silent council. They were homesick, weary of constant marching and monsoon rains, and terrified by the rumors of the monstrous force awaiting them. Their refusal was not a violent revolt, but a profound collective act of will. They simply would not go any further. Alexander, the king who had never been denied, retreated to his tent for 3 days, hoping their resolve would break. It did not. Faced with the unified refusal of the men who were the foundation of his power, he had no choice. He turned the army around, ordering a giant altar built to mark the farthest point of his journey, a monument to an ambition finally checked not by an enemy, but by his own men's courage to say enough. This moment on the riverbank was a quiet mutiny that changed the map of history. So we must ask, what if the army's spirit had broken instead of Alexander's will? What if, after his 3 days of silence, the veterans had relented, shouldering their arms one more time to cross the Hyphases? The immediate consequence is a collision of ancient superpowers. The Macedonian army, though brilliant and battle-hardened, was a tiny, exhausted force compared to the fresh, colossal armies of the Nanda. A direct invasion would have been a desperate gamble, likely leading to a protracted, bloody war of attrition in an alien environment. Even if Alexander achieved his usual tactical miracles, consolidating control over the densely populated Ganges plain would have required years, perhaps decades, of brutal campaigning. The strain might have shattered his empire from within, but let's assume, for the sake of this fragile thread, that Alexander's genius prevailed yet again. A Macedonian foothold in the Ganges Valley opens a breathtaking alternative. The intense cultural fusion Alexander pursued, seen in his adoption of Persian dress and his promotion of intermarriage, would have extended into the Indian heartland. Greek artistic styles, with their focus on realistic human form, could have blended with emerging Buddhist and Hindu artistic traditions centuries earlier than the actual Greco-Buddhist art of the later Gandhara region. Philosophical exchange could have flowed both ways, Greek rational inquiry meeting with the intricate metaphysical systems of India might have sparked intellectual revolutions in both traditions. The development of Buddhism, still a growing tradition at this time, could have been influenced by Hellenistic philosophical concepts, potentially altering its doctrinal spread westward. Politically, a Hellenistic kingdom based in the Punjab or the Ganges would have created a permanent Greek-oriented power bloc in South Asia. This changes the entire geopolitical timeline. The later Mauryan Empire, which unified India under Chandragupta to just a few years after Alexander's death, might never have risen in the same way, or might have had to contend with a powerful Hellenistic rival on its western border. The trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to India would have been direct conduits for ideas, goods, and people, creating a truly contiguous Hellenistic world from the Adriatic Sea to the Bay of Bengal. The mutiny at the Hyphases was not a failure. It was a boundary drawn by human endurance. In that moment, his soldiers chose a known world of return over an unknown world of endless war. Their decision spared the Indian subcontinent one conquest, but in doing so, it also sealed off a potential fusion of East and West so profound that our own world still feels the echo of its absence. Alexander's soldiers turned back from the Hyphases River, but the empire he left behind was a prize too vast for any one man to hold. His sudden passing without a clear heir plunged his conquests into a 40-year nightmare of shifting alliances and brutal wars as his former generals, the Diadochi, fought for the pieces. By the year 301 before Common Era, the conflict had narrowed to a final, decisive confrontation. On the plains near Ipsus, two great coalitions faced each other. On one side stood Antigonus the One-Eyed and his brilliant son Demetrius, the last men who dreamed of reuniting Alexander's entire empire under their own banner. Arrayed against them were the other successors, led by Seleucus, who ruled the east, and Lysimachus, who held lands in Thrace. The armies were colossal, the largest assembled since Alexander's time, and the fate of the Hellenistic world rested on the outcome. The battle began with a stunning success for Antigonus's side. Demetrius, commanding the elite heavy cavalry on the right wing, launched a thunderous charge that shattered the opposing horsemen led by Antiochus, Seleucus's son. It was a textbook maneuver, a classic hammer blow meant to roll up the enemy line. But in his moment of triumph, Demetrius made a fatal error. Instead of wheeling immediately to strike the exposed flank of the enemy's main infantry phalanx, he pursued the routed cavalry too far, chasing them from the field. This left the center of the battle, where his father Antigonus commanded the core phalanx, dangerously isolated. Seleucus, a master strategist, saw the opening. He had a secret weapon he had brought from the eastern satrapies, a force of nearly 500 war elephants. He did not send them in a direct charge. Instead, he positioned this living wall between the distant Demetrius and the main battle, creating an impassable barrier of towering flesh and tusks. From his position, the elderly Antigonus could see his son's victorious banners in the distance, but he could also see the solid line of elephants that now stood between them. He watched as the allied phalanxes of Seleucus and Lysimachus, supported by archers and lighter troops, began to encircle his own infantry. The battle was slipping away, not because his forces were broken, but because they were cut in two. Demetrius, realizing his mistake, turned his cavalry and raced back, only to be met by that immovable elephantine wall. The creatures, trained for this very purpose, trumpeted and formed a dense line, their mere presence causing the horses to panic and refuse to advance. Demetrius was helpless, forced to watch from across a field of dust and chaos as the enemy closed in on his father's position. Antigonus, still believing his son would break through, stood firm until a shower of javelins finally found their mark. With his fall, the last hope for a unified empire died on the field at Ipsus. But let us rewind to that critical pivot point. What if Demetrius had shown the discipline of a true king instead of the zeal of a cavalry commander? Imagine he halts the pursuit, ignores the fleeing enemy, and immediately turns his fresh, unbeaten squadrons inward. The elephant screen is still moving into position, not yet fully formed. A determined, concentrated charge by the best cavalry in the world, led by a commander of Demetrius's skill, might have punched through the gaps or found a way around the flanks of Seleucus's animal corps. Success would have changed everything. Demetrius's horsemen, crashing into the side of the allied phalanx, would have relieved the pressure on his father's infantry at the perfect moment. The battle likely tips into a rout for the allies. Antigonus and Demetrius win the day, and with it the war. A victory at Ipsus would have made the Antigonid dynasty the unchallenged masters of Alexander's legacy. Seleucus and Lysimachus would have been defeated, their territories absorbed. Instead of a fractured world of three major kingdoms, Macedonia, Ptolemaic Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire, constantly warring with each other, the Mediterranean and Near East would have been ruled by a single, powerful Hellenistic superstate. This unified empire, stretching from Greece to the borders of India, would have possessed immense resources and a centralized military. Such an entity would have presented a completely different challenge to the rising power in the West, the Roman Republic. Rome's expansion was famously opportunistic, conquering one divided Hellenistic kingdom after another over the course of a century, playing them off against each other. They never had to face a united Hellenistic East. A consolidated Antigonid empire with the wealth of Asia and the military traditions of Alexander could have met Roman legions not as separate, squabbling clients but as a peer. The cultural trajectory of the West shifts profoundly. Greek language, art, and administration remain dominant under a continuous imperial system. potentially delaying or even altering the spread of Latin and Roman law. The intellectual center of the world might have remained firmly in Alexandria and Antioch rather than eventually shifting to Rome. The Battle of Ipsus was decided not by the failure of courage, but by a lapse in judgment and a wall of elephants. In that lapse, the unified dream of Alexander shattered forever, creating the fractured political map that would, piece by piece, become the foundation of another empire's destiny. The unified empire Alexander's successors failed to create left a power vacuum in the West that two young republics would fight to fill. For over a century, Rome and Carthage circled each other in a struggle for the Mediterranean, a conflict that reached its most desperate hour on a dusty Italian plain at Cannae. There, in the year 216 before Common Era, Hannibal Barca executed a tactical masterpiece, surrounding and effectively ending a Roman army twice the size of his own. It was the worst defeat in Roman history, a loss so catastrophic it is said the rings of fallen senators were collected by the bushel. The road to Rome, some 250 miles to the northwest, now lay virtually undefended. In the victorious Carthaginian camp, Hannibal's Numidian cavalry commander Mahabal saw the opportunity of a lifetime. He famously urged his general to act immediately, promising that in 5 days Hannibal could dine in the Roman capital. But Hannibal hesitated. He praised Mahabal's spirit but rejected the plan, choosing instead to rest his army and consolidate his position in southern Italy. This moment of pause, celebrated by some historians as prudent, is one of history's most agonizing what-ifs. Hannibal's reasoning was strategic and, from his perspective, sound. His army, though triumphant, was exhausted from the brutal fight. It was a mixed force of Carthaginians, Spaniards, Celts, and Numidians, far from home and without a reliable supply line or significant siege equipment. Rome itself was a massive city with formidable walls, defended by a population that had just witnessed a national tragedy and would likely fight with desperate fury. A failed siege would shatter the aura of invincibility he had carefully built. Furthermore, Hannibal believed the political strategy was working. He hoped the crushing defeat would trigger the collapse of Rome's system of alliances, that the Italian cities would defect to him, isolating Rome and forcing a negotiated peace on his terms. Marching on the city, he feared, might unite the Romans in a last stand and alienate potential allies. So he stayed, seeking to win the war through pressure and persuasion rather than a single, risky assault on the enemy's heart. But what if Hannibal had possessed the reckless nerve of a Demetrius or the instinctive boldness of Alexander at the Granicus? What if he had listened to Mahabal and within hours of the battle's end, his weary but euphoric army was on the march, a relentless column moving north along the Via Appia? The psychological impact alone would have been a weapon of mass panic. News of Cannae would have reached Rome only slightly ahead of the news that Hannibal himself was at the gates. The city would have descended into absolute chaos. The Senate, already decimated by the loss of so many of its members, would be gripped by factional blame and terror. A mass evacuation of civilians might have clogged the roads, while the remaining 2 legions in the city, manned by raw recruits and veterans too old for the field, scrambled to man the lengthy walls. Hannibal would not have needed to storm the city immediately. His mere presence camped before the Colline Gate would have been an unbearable political crisis. In this atmosphere of supreme pressure, a negotiated peace becomes not just possible but probable. Roman ambassadors, facing the unthinkable reality of a besieged capital, would have been forced to treat with Hannibal from a position of utter weakness. The terms would have been severe. Rome likely surrenders its recent conquests, ceding Sicily, Sardinia, and perhaps even parts of southern Italy back to Carthaginian influence. They would be forced to pay a staggering war indemnity, disavow alliances with cities that had defected to Hannibal, and accept a limit on the size of their navy. The Roman Republic, humiliated and financially broken, is contained. It becomes a powerful Italian state, but its dream of Mediterranean empire is extinguished in its infancy. The ripple effects redefine the ancient world. Carthage, not Rome, becomes the undisputed commercial and naval superpower. The Hellenistic kingdoms of the East now look to Carthage as their primary Western contact, altering trade and diplomatic currents. Without a dominant, expansionist Rome, the cultural and political development of Western Europe follows a completely different path. Latin might never become the lingua franca of law and administration. The legal concepts, engineering projects, and even the very model of republican government that Rome would later bequeath to the world are either stillborn or emerge in a radically different form filtered through a Punic lens. The entire foundation of Western civilization as we know it rests, in part, on Hannibal's calculated decision to rest his men after their greatest victory, a choice that left the road to Rome open in reality but forever closed in history. Hannibal's army remained camped in southern Italy, a shadow over the peninsula, but the true battle now shifted from the field to the Roman Senate. The news from Cannae was not just a military report, it was an existential scream. An entire generation of leadership was gone. Tens of thousands of citizens were lost. In the wake of such a blow, the natural human response is to seek an end to the pain, to negotiate, to cut losses. A Carthaginian envoy soon arrived, offering to ransom the thousands of Roman prisoners taken at Cannae. It was a standard practice, a financial transaction that would bring sons and fathers home. The Senate gathered in a city thick with grief, every family touched by loss. The easy path, the expected path, was clear. Pay the ransom, recover the men, and use that gesture to open talks for a negotiated peace. Yet the Senate did something that defied all contemporary logic and human emotion. They refused. They voted to not pay a single coin for the prisoners. They declared that Romans who allowed themselves to be captured while still able to fight were not worthy of the state's treasury. It was a brutal, cold calculation, a message sent in stone rather than silver. But their next move was even more astonishing. With scarcely any veteran soldiers left, they did not sue for peace. Instead, they raised new legions from nothing. They enrolled boys below the traditional age, freed slaves, and granted them citizenship in exchange for service, and melted down temple treasures to fund new ships. They fielded an army with men who had never held a sword, led by commanders learning from the gravestones of their predecessors. The state chose to fight on, bankrupting itself in spirit and treasure for a principle, the absolute refusal to accept defeat. This was not strategy, it was something closer to national dogma. Now, let us hold that moment of decision in the Senate House and gently tip the scales the other way. What if the grief had been too heavy, the fear too real? Imagine a different faction gaining influence, one arguing for pragmatism over pride. In this timeline, the Senate agrees to the ransom, and those prisoners return to Rome. This act is seen not as weakness, but as the first step toward a negotiated settlement. Facing financial ruin and a depleted population, Rome sues for peace from a position of undeniable weakness. The treaty with Carthage is harsh. Rome relinquishes all claims to Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. It agrees to a vast indemnity, limits the size of its navy to a coastal patrol force, and perhaps even cedes influence in parts of southern Italy. The Roman Republic is contained, reduced to a powerful but regional Italian power, its wings decisively clipped. The consequences of such a peace redefine the ancient world. Carthage, having humbled its greatest rival, consolidates its maritime empire across the western Mediterranean. It becomes the unchallenged commercial superpower, its influence stretching unopposed from North Africa to Spain and beyond. The cultural and political map of Europe develops along a completely different axis. Without Roman expansion, the Celtic and Germanic tribes of Western Europe experience a slower, different integration, likely influenced more by Carthaginian trade networks than Roman roads and legions. The Hellenistic kingdoms of the East, which in our history were gradually absorbed by Rome, now engage with a Punic world. The Latin language, instead of becoming the foundation for Romance languages and legal thought, remains a regional tongue. The very concept of republicanism and civic virtue that Rome would later exemplify for all its flaws might never crystallize into a model that echoes through millennia. The Roman decision after Cannae was a choice to stare into the abyss and refuse to blink. It was a collective bet that will could manufacture material, that spirit could fill the gaps in a battle line. By choosing the path of maximum resistance, they did not just save their city, they forged the relentless, uncompromising character of an empire that did not yet exist. That character, born in the darkest hour of the Republic, would go on to shape the destiny of continents. The relentless will that rebuilt Rome after Cannae was a fire that could not be quenched until its source of fear was utterly erased. For decades after Hannibal's defeat, Carthage complied with every harsh treaty, paid its indemnities, and focused on peaceful commerce. It became prosperous again, a success that only deepened Roman suspicion. In the year 149 before Common Era, Rome found a final pretext for war. The Third Punic War was not a conflict for territory but for existence. The Roman demand was simple and impossible. The Carthaginians must abandon their magnificent coastal city and rebuild inland. They refused, choosing to fight for their home in a siege that would last 3 desperate years. The final act of Carthage was a testament to human ingenuity under the most extreme pressure. With their harbor blockaded and their farmland ravaged, the city transformed itself into a fortress of last resort. Every open space became a workshop, forging weapons day and night. Temples and public buildings were converted into armories. According to ancient accounts, the citizens even used the hair of women to weave cords for new catapults, a symbol of total communal sacrifice. For 3 years they repelled Roman assaults, repaired breaches in their walls, and fought in the rubble of their own streets. The Roman commanders, expecting a quick victory, were stunned by the ferocity and creativity of the defense. This was not the army of Hannibal, it was the entire population fighting with nothing left to lose. Yet as the siege dragged into its final, agonizing months, a fragile thread of possibility remained. Carthage was not completely alone in the world. Just to the west lay the kingdom of Numidia, a former ally now grown powerful under Roman patronage. To the east, the Hellenistic kingdoms, particularly the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, watched with apprehension as Rome moved to annihilate a fellow major power. The pivotal what if of this war hangs on a single question: what if one of these neighbors had decided to intervene? Even a modest show of force, a fleet of supplies breaking the Roman naval blockade, or a Numidian army threatening the Roman rear, could have altered the calculus entirely. Numidia, under King Massinissa, had been a Roman ally for decades, but his long reign was ending. A different successor, one less beholden to Rome or more fearful of a Roman province on his own border, might have seen the wisdom in preserving a balance of power. A timely shipment of grain or a cavalry raid on Roman supply lines could have provided Carthage with the crucial margin it needed to prolong the siege further. In the east, the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, though officially friendly with Rome, understood the danger of a Rome with no remaining rivals. A discreet convoy of arms or a diplomatic mission applying pressure on the Roman Senate could have sown enough doubt to make a negotiated peace seem preferable to the costly, ongoing slaughter. A prolonged stalemate or a peace brokered by a third party changes everything. Carthage survives not as a great military power, but as a wealthy, independent commercial city-state. It remains a permanent cultural and economic counterweight to Rome in the Western Mediterranean. The Roman psyche, which became defined by the absolute elimination of its rival, instead learns a lesson in limits. The complete destruction of the city, the infamous salting of the earth, and the sale of its surviving population into captivity, events that became a dark legend of Roman ruthlessness, never occur. Instead, the Mediterranean world retains a vibrant, multicultural hub of Punic language, religion, and trade. This enduring Carthage influences the development of North Africa and Iberia for centuries, its maritime networks offering an alternative to Roman economic dominance. The Roman model of total annihilation as the solution to rivalry is not cemented into its imperial policy, potentially leading to a different, more pluralistic approach to managing other powers. The Siege of Carthage was not just the end of a city, it was the moment Rome chose to ensure it would never have an equal in its home waters. But for a few shiploads of grain or a single king's change of heart, that equal might have lived on, forever changing the character of the sea at the center of the world. The Siege of Alesia stands as a masterclass in Roman engineering, but it was also a trap that nearly caught its own designer. In the year 52 before Common Era, Julius Caesar had finally cornered the charismatic leader of the Gallic revolt, Vercingetorix, within the hilltop fortress. Yet Caesar's own army, perhaps 40,000 strong, was now caught between two desperate forces, the 80,000 warriors inside Alesia, and a massive relief army of over 250,000 Gauls gathering on the horizon. Caesar's response was to build not one, but two concentric rings of fortifications, an inner line facing the fortress to prevent a breakout, and an outer line facing the countryside to hold back the relief force. He was building walls to sit in the middle of a storm. The crisis came when the relief army arrived. For days, they probed the outer defenses, looking for weakness. Then they launched a massive, coordinated assault from the outside, targeting a seemingly vulnerable section of the Roman lines. At the same moment, Vercingetorix, watching from the heights, led every man he could muster in a ferocious sortie from inside the walls. Caesar's legions were now attacked from both sides simultaneously, fighting for their lives in the narrow, deadly space between their own walls. The ancient sources describe a moment of sheer chaos, where the sheer weight of Gallic numbers and the courage of their leaders nearly overwhelmed the Roman defenses. At one critical point, a Gallic breakthrough seemed imminent, and Caesar himself had to rush to the threatened sector, his distinctive red cloak rallying his men in a last, desperate stand. The battle hung by a thread. Now consider a slight shift in that chaotic hour. What if the coordination between the two Gallic forces had been perfect? Imagine the relief force's main assault striking the exact same section of the outer wall that Vercingetorix's men were simultaneously attacking from the inside. Under that concentrated hammer and anvil pressure, even the formidable Roman fortifications would have likely buckled. A breach in both lines would have allowed the two Gallic armies to link up, pouring into the Roman camp. The result would have been a catastrophic defeat for Caesar. His legions, surrounded and overwhelmed, would have been destroyed or captured. The loss of 8 veteran legions would have been a military and political disaster on a scale Rome had not seen since Cannae. The immediate consequence is the total collapse of Roman authority in Gaul. Vercingetorix, the victor of Alesia, becomes the unchallenged leader of a unified, independent Gallic confederation, his prestige immortal. Gaul remains free of Roman rule, a powerful Celtic kingdom that changes the cultural and political landscape of Western Europe permanently, but the deeper shockwave hits Rome itself. Caesar, if he even survived the battle, returns not as a conquering hero, but as a disgraced commander who lost an entire army. His political career, built on military glory and the riches of Gaul, is finished. The delicate balance of power in the late Republic, already strained between Caesar, Pompey, and the Senate, is now missing one of its 3 pillars. The civil war that actually erupted just a few years later might never have occurred, or would have been a very different conflict between Pompey and a strengthened Senate. The rise of the imperial system, so deeply tied to Caesar's legacy and the actions of his heir Augustus, is thrown into profound doubt. The Republic, without the catalyst of Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, might have stumbled on in its dysfunctional form for decades longer or collapsed under a different crisis. The world that emerged from the Roman Empire with its laws, languages, and roads was forged in the fires of Gaul. At Alesia, that future was defended not just by Roman swords, but by the narrowest of gaps in a wall and a timing of attacks that was almost but not quite synchronized. The desperate gamble at Alesia secured Gaul for Rome, but the victory only accelerated the political crisis at home. By 48 before Common Era, the rivalry between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great had erupted into open civil war. Caesar, having crossed the Rubicon with a single legion, moved with shocking speed, seizing Italy and driving Pompey and the senatorial faction across the Adriatic to Greece. There, Pompey assembled a vast army, drawing on the resources of the eastern provinces. He also commanded the undisputed mastery of the sea, with a powerful fleet that controlled every supply route. His strategic position was, on paper, overwhelmingly superior. Caesar, by contrast, had managed to ferry only a portion of his loyal veterans across the Adriatic in a risky winter crossing, leaving him with a smaller, isolated force on foreign soil. Pompey understood his advantage perfectly. In his war council before the decisive engagement at Pharsalus, he advocated for a plan of masterful patience. He proposed avoiding a pitched battle entirely. Instead, his immense fleet would tighten a naval noose, intercepting every supply ship and foraging party. Caesar's men, though fiercely loyal, would slowly be worn down by hunger and deprivation, trapped in a hostile land with no means of escape or reinforcement. It was a strategy of exhaustion, a certain path to victory without risking the fortunes of a single day on the battlefield. Yet this cold, logical plan was rejected, not by the enemy but by Pompey's own allies. The senators and nobles who had fled Rome with him, the Optimate faction, grew impatient in their luxurious camp. They were wealthy, politically influential, and utterly confident in the sheer size of their army. They mocked Pompey's caution, accusing him of deliberately prolonging the war to retain his command. They demanded a swift, glorious confrontation to crush the upstart Caesar and return them to their estates and privileges in Rome. The political pressure became a roar that drowned out military reason. Pompey, the senior statesman and general, found his authority eroded by the very men he was protecting. Reluctantly, against his own better judgment, he gave the order to form battle lines on the plain of Pharsalus. The result was a catastrophe for the Optimates. Caesar's veterans, though outnumbered, were a hardened instrument of war. They broke Pompey's cavalry charge with a clever reserve of dedicated infantry, and then rolled up the entire senatorial line. Pompey fled the field, his grand army dissolving behind him. His naval supremacy meant nothing once the legions on land were shattered, but let us hold that moment in the war council. What if Pompey had possessed the political fortitude to silence his critics and enforce his original strategy? Imagine the legions of Caesar, not arrayed for a morning battle, but growing gaunt as the weeks turn into months. The Adriatic Sea, a highway for Caesar in winter, becomes an impassable prison under the watchful eyes of Pompey's fleets. No supplies get through. Foraging parties are ambushed by Pompey's more numerous cavalry. Morale, even among the most devoted legionaries, begins to fracture as hunger sets in. Caesar, the master of rapid movement and decisive action, is forced into a static war of attrition for which he is ill-equipped. In this prolonged struggle, the dynamics of the entire conflict shift. Time works against Caesar. Back in Italy, political uncertainty might grow without his commanding presence. The loyalty of other provinces could waver as Pompey is seen steadily grinding down the rebel force. A desperate, starving attempt by Caesar to break out of the encirclement could lead to a battle on far less favorable terms, or even to the surrender of his army. A defeat under these circumstances would be the end of Caesar's cause. Captured or killed, his legacy is that of a failed rebel. The Optimate faction, led by Pompey, returns to Rome triumphant. The old republican system, though deeply flawed and rife with inequality, is given a new lease on life. the Senate reasserts its authority, likely attempting reforms to prevent another military strongman from rising. The office of dictator, which Caesar would soon claim for life, remains a temporary emergency measure. The entire subsequent course of Roman history bends away from empire. The rise of Augustus, the creation of the Principate, the long line of emperors, and the Pax Romana that defined the classical world for centuries, all stem from the outcome of this civil war. A Pompeian victory at Pharsalus, or rather through the avoidance of Pharsalus, resets the Roman experiment. It preserves a republic in name, though likely still destined for internal strife, and prevents the concentration of power that would define the imperial age. The world that inherited Roman law, architecture, and language might still have done so, but from a political system that ended not with an emperor's decree, but with the slow, contentious votes of a Senate that had, against all odds, won its most desperate battle by refusing to fight at all. The political survival of the Roman Republic was a mirage, shattered by the ambitions of the men who claimed to save it. In the wake of Julius Caesar's passing, a new power structure emerged, the second triumvirate of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. This alliance, forged in proscription lists and blood, was always temporary. By the year 31 before Common Era, the Mediterranean world had been cleaved in two, divided between Octavian in the west and Mark Antony in the east, who had forged a deep political and personal alliance with Cleopatra VII, the Hellenistic queen of Egypt. The final confrontation was inevitable, and it would be decided not on the familiar soil of Greece, but on the unpredictable water of the Ambracian Gulf. At Actium, two visions for Rome's future faced each other across a narrow stretch of sea. Octavian's fleet, commanded by the skilled Agrippa, was composed of lighter, more maneuverable Liburnian ships. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was larger and heavier, built for the traditional tactic of closing with an enemy vessel, ramming and boarding, where his superior legionary infantry could decide the fight. The battle began as a slow, grinding stalemate, with Agrippa wisely refusing to be drawn into a close-quarters brawl. He used his speed to harass the flanks of Antony's formation, aiming to disable ships from a distance with catapults and arrows. As the day wore on, the lines became a confused mass and a crucial gap opened in the center. Cleopatra's squadron, stationed in the rear, saw its chance. With sails suddenly unfurled amidst the oar-powered battle, her 60 ships shot through this opening and broke out into the open sea. Then came the pivotal, bewildering decision. Mark Antony, seeing her departure, abandoned his flagship, transferred to a faster vessel, and followed her, leaving the bulk of his fleet and army to their fate. The ancient sources are conflicted on the motive. Was it a pre-arranged escape plan for their treasury, a moment of personal despair, or a catastrophic miscommunication? Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The heart went out of the Antonian resistance. Their leader was gone, sailing away with the Egyptian queen. The remaining ships fought on for hours, but without direction or hope. They were gradually overwhelmed or surrendered. The battle was lost not through destruction, but through desertion at the most critical hour. Now, let us anchor that moment in the chaotic water of Actium and change a single variable. What if Antony's heavier ships had managed the one thing Agrippa was determined to prevent, a general melee? Imagine a shift in the wind or a more aggressive initial push that allows the Antonian center to lock Agrippa's lighter vessels into close combat. This is the scenario Octavian feared most. Once the ships are grappled together, the battle transforms. It is no longer a contest of nautical maneuver, but an infantry fight on unstable wooden platforms. Here, Antony's advantage is overwhelming. His decks are packed with veteran legionaries, the finest heavy infantry in the world, armed for face-to-face combat. Octavian's crews, by contrast, are primarily marines and sailors, not trained for this kind of brutal, confined fighting. In a series of boarding actions, Antony's infantry could have cleared deck after deck, capturing or sinking Agrippa's ships. A decisive naval victory at Actium, with Octavian's fleet captured or in flight, inverts the entire political landscape. Octavian, trapped on the Greek coast without naval support, faces disaster. His claim to power, always resting on a fragile blend of propaganda and military success, evaporates. Antony and Cleopatra are triumphant. The immediate consequence is the solidification of a dual capital system for the Roman world. Rome remains the symbolic heart in the West, but the real center of gravity shifts east to Alexandria, a city of immense wealth, learning, and ancient prestige. Antony and Cleopatra, as victorious co-rulers, establish a new Greco-Egyptian-oriented dynasty. The Roman East is not merely administered, it is embraced as the cultural and political core of a new empire. This changes the foundational character of the regime that follows, the Principate. Instead of Augustus's careful restoration of Roman Republican imagery and traditional values, the imperial model is infused from the start with Hellenistic monarchy and Egyptian ceremonial tradition. The ruler is not a first citizen but a divine king in the Eastern mold, allied with a powerful queen who is herself a living goddess. The cultural repercussions are profound. Latin might remain the language of law in the West, but Greek and the cultural influences of Alexandria become the dominant forces in art, architecture, philosophy, and court life. The early empire looks and feels fundamentally different, more Alexandrian than Roman. The religious development of the empire could also shift, as Egyptian cults like that of Isis are not merely popular imports, but state-sponsored pillars of the ruling dynasty's legitimacy. The Battle of Actium was not merely a contest for political control, it was a cultural referendum. By sailing away, Antony and Cleopatra did not just lose a battle, they seeded the narrative of Rome's future. Their victory would have woven the threads of Hellenistic Egypt directly into the fabric of imperial rule, creating a tapestry far more Eastern in its pattern, and leaving the Rome of history as we know it as a fading silhouette on a distant shore. The see at Actium had decided that Rome's future would be written in Latin, not Greek, but the empire's northern frontier remained a vast and unfinished story. Beyond the Rhine lay Germania, a land of dense forests and fiercely independent tribes, a puzzle the Romans were determined to solve. By the year 9 of the Common Era, the governor of this volatile region was Publius Quinctilius Varus, a man of political connections but little recent military experience. He believed the work of conquest was nearly complete, that the tribes were accepting Roman law, taxes, and camps. His trusted advisor in this process was a young Germanic chieftain named Arminius, who had been raised in Rome as a hostage, served with distinction in its auxiliary forces, and been granted equestrian rank. To Varus, Arminius was the ideal model of Romanization, a bridge between two worlds. When reports of a minor uprising arose from a distant part of the territory, Arminius advised a route through the Teutoburg forest to quell it quickly. Varus, confident in his guide and his 3 veteran legions, agreed. He ignored the whispered warnings from other Germanic nobles, dismissing them as tribal rivalry. The decision to leave the fortified roads and enter that trackless, rain-soaked wilderness was a fatal error in judgment. The Roman column, stretched out for miles with soldiers, camp followers, and wagons, became entangled in the mud and narrow paths. Then, from the mist and the trees, the attack came. It was not a battle, but a prolonged, brutal ambush that lasted for days. Arminius' warriors, using the terrain they knew intimately, harried the trapped legions from all sides, destroying them piece by piece. When it was over, 3 entire legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, had been wiped from the Roman army list, a loss so profound that the Emperor Augustus was said to wander his palace, crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." But what if a single piece of caution had penetrated Varus' confidence? Imagine he had listened to the dissenting voices, perhaps from Segestes, another chieftain who explicitly warned him of Arminius' betrayal. Instead of plunging into the forest, Varus orders his column to turn back to the safety of the summer camps or takes a longer, open route along the Lip River. The ambush is avoided. The 3 legions, bloodied perhaps by skirmishes but intact, remain the iron fist of Roman power east of the Rhine. This changes the entire dynamic of the frontier. With its military strength preserved, Rome continues its methodical process of pacification and settlement. Forts become towns, roads cut through the forests, and the tribal structure gradually gives way to provincial administration. Germania, over the following generations, is integrated into the empire as Gaul had been. The cultural consequences of this are almost impossible to overstate. The Rhine ceases to be a permanent military border and becomes a river within the empire like the Danube. Latin, not early Germanic dialects, becomes the language of law, commerce, and eventually the common tongue. The region's pagan beliefs slowly syncretize with Roman religion rather than developing in isolation. Centuries later, the great migrations of Germanic tribes that contributed to the fall of the Western Roman Empire would involve populations already deeply Romanized in culture and loyalty. The linguistic map of Europe is redrawn, with the Germanic language family potentially remaining confined to Scandinavia and far northern coasts, while a Romance-speaking region extends hundreds of miles further east. The very identity of modern nations like Germany is born from a resistance myth rooted in the Teutoburg forest. Without that foundational story of a heroic, united stand against an invader, the cultural memory and political development of Central Europe follow an entirely different Romanized path. The trust Varus placed in a single man did more than doom 3 legions. It carved a deep, lasting line between 2 worlds, a border in the mind that would shape continents for 2,000 years. The Teutoburg forest defined a border in the north, but in the empire's eastern provinces, a different kind of boundary was about to be shattered. The great city of Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of Judaism, became the focal point of a catastrophic rebellion against Roman rule. By the year 70 of the Common Era, the legions of the future Emperor Titus had surrounded its towering walls, but the greatest threat to the defenders was not outside the stone. It was the bitter, violent division within. The Jewish resistance was fractured into rival factions, the Zealots, the Idumeans, and others, each claiming authority. They fought each other in the streets, burned each other's food stores, and executed those who spoke of compromise. This civil war inside a siege turned a unified defense into a chaotic struggle for power, even as the Roman engineering works drew ever closer. The city's fate was sealed not just by Roman battering rams, but by this self-inflicted chaos. One cannot help but wonder, what if a single voice of pragmatic authority had risen above the tumult? Imagine a leader, perhaps a respected priest or a former commander, who could unite the factions not for a final, doomed battle, but for a difficult negotiation. In the early months of the Roman advance, before the siege lines were complete and the city's fate irrevocable, such a leader might have had a chance. He would have understood that military victory was impossible, but that salvation for the city's soul was not. His goal would not have been independence, which Rome would never grant, but terms. A negotiated surrender, while painful, could have had one paramount condition: the preservation of the temple and the central religious structures. For Rome, this was not an unthinkable concession. The empire was often pragmatic in matters of local religion, so long as political submission was clear. A peaceful surrender that maintained public order and continued the flow of temple taxes might have been preferable to the costly, brutal siege that actually unfolded. Had such a treaty been struck, the physical and spiritual center of Jewish life would have remained intact. The Second Temple, the place of pilgrimage and sacrifice, would have continued to stand. This single fact changes the trajectory of religious history in profound ways. Without the catastrophic trauma of the temple's destruction, Judaism undergoes a different evolution. The slow shift in focus from centralized priestly sacrifice to local synagogue study and prayer, a necessary adaptation to exile, happens more gradually without the acute sense of catastrophic loss. The rabbinic tradition that would eventually codify the Talmud still develops, but its character is shaped by continuity with the temple, not its utter absence. The ripple effects extend into the early Christian movement as well. In its first decades, Christianity existed largely as a sect within Judaism, debating whether Gentile converts needed to follow Jewish law. The destruction of the temple in 70 was a seismic event that accelerated the separation between the two faiths, as each interpreted the catastrophe through its own theological lens. With the temple still standing, that forceful divorce is less definitive. The early church continues to grapple with its Jewish roots in a context where the Jewish religious establishment remains physically and symbolically present in Jerusalem. The theological arguments and the eventual parting of ways might follow a slower, more complex path, potentially leading to a very different relationship between the two world religions that emerge. The tragedy of Jerusalem was a collision of imperial might and fervent belief, but it was the internal strife that robbed the city of its last, best chance for preservation. In that cacophony of conflicting voices, the possibility of a future where the heart of ancient worship still beat was lost, leaving faith itself to find a new, more scattered rhythm. The internal strife that doomed Jerusalem was a lesson in the cost of division, but the Roman Empire was about to meet a foe whose unity was its greatest strength. Far to the north, beyond the Danube, the kingdom of Dacia had grown powerful under its shrewd and charismatic king, Decebalus. He commanded a formidable army, wealth from rich gold mines, and a homeland of sheer, forested mountains and narrow passes that formed a natural fortress. When Emperor Trajan, at the height of Roman power and confidence, decided to bring this kingdom to heel, he expected a campaign of glory. What he found in the Carpathian passes during his first war from 101 to 102 was something closer to a nightmare. The Dacians did not offer the set-piece battle Rome desired. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, launching ambushes from the thick woods, using the steep slopes to roll deadly projectiles onto marching columns, and disappearing into a landscape they knew intimately. The Roman legions, trained for open-field combat and siegecraft, were like giants struggling in a dense, hostile thicket. Every mile forward was paid for in blood and exhaustion. The pivotal moment could have come in any one of those early, brutal clashes in the high passes. Picture a narrow defile shrouded in mist where the advance guard of a Roman legion has pushed too far ahead. The main column is stretched out for miles behind them on a treacherous trail. Suddenly, the silence shatters. From the cliffs above, a rain of boulders and spears crashes down, blocking the path forward and behind. From hidden gullies, Decebalus's warriors, clad in their distinctive falchion swords capable of shearing through a Roman shield, pour into the trapped formation. The legion's famous discipline breaks in the confined chaos. Unable to form their battle lines or use their artillery, they are cut down in a slaughter that echoes through the mountain stone. In our history, Trajan's generalship and Roman engineering perseverance narrowly avoided such a total disaster. But what if their luck had run out? A decisive Dacian victory, the annihilation of an entire legion in the Carpathians, would have sent a shockwave through the empire. Trajan, heralded as Optimus Princeps, the best of emperors, would have faced a humiliating military check. The political fallout in Rome could have been severe, undermining the aura of invincibility that was crucial to imperial authority. A forced retreat from Dacia would have preserved Decebalus's kingdom as a powerful, independent buffer state north of the Danube. This changes the strategic map of Europe for centuries. Rome's imperial focus, having met its match in the northeast, might have been diverted elsewhere, perhaps deeper into the east against Parthia, or a renewed, more cautious effort in Britain. The massive influx of Dacian gold that funded Trajan's vast building projects in Rome, including his famous Forum, never flows into the imperial treasury. Most consequentially, the province of Dacia is never established. Without a Roman Dacia, there is no sustained, centuries-long Latin influence implanted in that region. The linguistic and cultural evolution of Eastern Europe follows a different course, untouched by that direct Roman imprint. The powerful Dacian kingdom, having humbled Rome, stands as a lasting testament to the limits of imperial power, a permanent and formidable neighbor that forever alters the dynamics of the Danube frontier. The mountains that nearly broke Trajan's legions could have become the enduring wall that contained an empire's ambition. The mountains that broke Roman legions were not the only place where overconfidence met a desert of consequences. In the year 53 before Common Era, the wealthiest man in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus, stood on the banks of the Euphrates River. He had spent a lifetime building a fortune through shrewd business and political maneuvering, but he lacked the one currency that truly mattered in the late Republic: military glory on the scale of his rivals Pompey and Caesar. His solution was to invade the Parthian Empire, a powerful realm controlling the trade routes to the east. His army was formidable, 7 legions strong, supported by cavalry and auxiliaries, a force designed for the set peace battles Rome had mastered. A local Armenian king offered wise counsel, urging Crassus to use the mountain passes of Armenia as his invasion route, where the terrain would offer protection and water. Crassus refused, lured by the promise of a direct route across Mesopotamia. As his army marched south along the river, a Parthian nobleman named Ariamnes approached. Claiming to be a deserter, he offered to guide the Romans to the main Parthian force. He spoke of an army in disarray, easy prey for Crassus's legions. The Roman commander, desperate for a quick, glorious confrontation, believed him. The guide's true purpose was to lead the Romans away from the life-giving river and into the heart of the open, waterless desert. Trusting this stranger was Crassus's first fatal mistake. His second was acting on the information. Against the advice of his own officers, who begged him to remain near the water and fortify a camp, Crassus gave the order. He abandoned the safety of the riverbank and marched his entire army inland, following a phantom enemy into a sun-scorched wasteland. The heat was punishing. The dust-choked men and blinded formations. After hours of this grueling march, the horizon finally stirred, but it was not a disorganized rabble. It was the Parthian army, a force built around 2 terrifying components. The first was a cloud of horse archers, lightly armored riders who could unleash a continuous, withering hail of arrows from a distance, a tactic the heavy Roman infantry was utterly unprepared to counter. The second was the cataphracts, heavily armored cavalrymen and their horses, designed for a single, shattering charge. The Roman soldiers formed their traditional hollow square, a fortress of shields against infantry. But against an enemy that refused to close, it became a death trap. The Parthian horse archers circled endlessly, their arrows finding gaps in the armor. Any Roman charge was met with a feigned retreat, drawing the pursuers out into the open where they were cut down. The sun glinted off the polished scales of the cataphracts, who waited for the perfect moment to thunder into a weakened part of the line. By the end of that day, the Roman army was not just defeated, it was systematically dismantled. Crassus himself was killed during a parley, a final act of betrayal. Of the nearly 45,000 men who crossed the Euphrates, only a shattered remnant ever returned. It was a military disaster that echoed for generations, a permanent stain on Roman prestige in the East. But what if, on that riverbank, a more cautious instinct had prevailed? Imagine Crassus, his political ambition tempered for a moment by military prudence, looking at the eager guide with a senator's suspicion. He dismisses Ariamnes as a provocateur. He listens to his officers and does the very thing Roman legions did best: he digs. The army fortifies a strong camp right there, using the river to anchor a flank and ensure a limitless supply of water. He sends out scouts to find the true enemy, and he waits. This simple change of posture transforms the entire encounter. The Parthian commander, Shauna, now faces a problem. His entire strategy relies on mobility and drawing the enemy into the desert. A fortified Roman legion, well supplied and protected by trenches and palisades, is a target he cannot attack with horse archers alone. To achieve a result, he must either attempt a direct assault on the Roman fortifications, where his cavalry loses its advantage, or settle into a distant siege for which he is not equipped. The likely outcome is a stalemate. After days or weeks of fruitless circling, with the Roman position unshaken and his own supplies dwindling, Shauna might well be forced to withdraw. Crassus, having faced down the legendary Parthian cavalry without breaking, could claim a defensive victory. He returns to Syria not with the riches of Ctesiphon, but with his army intact and his reputation as a competent commander secured, if not glorified. The preservation of those 7 legions and Crassus's political standing recalibrates the balance of the first triumvirate. Caesar and Pompey now have to contend with a third partner who is not a disgraced ghost, but a living, powerful rival with a loyal army and the vast resources to fund it. The delicate alliance might fracture differently or hold longer under a more equal distribution of military prestige. The civil war between Caesar and Pompey, which defined the next decade, might have become a three-way struggle or been averted entirely through a more complex and cautious political dance. Crassus's death at Carrhae removed the wealthiest and most politically flexible member of the trio, a stabilizer whose absence made the final clash between the other two almost inevitable. His survival introduces a wild card, a man with the means to bankroll either side or champion a third, altering the very DNA of the conflict that would end the Republic. The desert that day demanded a choice between the lure of easy glory and the hard work of patience. In choosing the mirage, Crassus did not just lose an army, he evaporated a future where Rome's internal power struggle had 3 faces instead of 2, leaving the sands of history to be shaped by a duel he never lived to see. The desert at Carrhae taught a brutal lesson about trusting mirages, but a century later, another Roman general would stake his future on a vision of a different kind. In the autumn of 312, Constantine marched toward Rome to confront his rival Maxentius, who held the city with a formidable army. The two forces met at the Milvian Bridge, a crossing point over the Tiber River. On the eve of the battle, the story goes that Constantine experienced a profound moment of clarity. According to later accounts, he saw a sign in the heavens, a cross of light, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." This was not a vague omen, but a direct instruction. The next morning, he ordered his soldiers to paint a Christian symbol, the Carrhae, on their shields, a gesture that must have seemed bewildering to an army steeped in the worship of Jupiter and Mars. Constantine, a man raised in the traditional pagan cults of the empire, was making an unprecedented gamble, tying his military fortune to the god of a minority faith that had only recently faced severe persecution. His decision to embrace this sign transformed the battle from a mere political clash into a cosmic contest. When the armies engaged, Constantine's forces fought with a conviction that they were now divinely favored, and Maxentius's army was routed, with Maxentius himself drowning in the Tiber during the retreat. The victory was complete, and with it, Constantine secured his rule over the western half of the empire. But the true victory was not just political, it was spiritual, setting in motion the Christianization of Rome itself. Now rewind to that quiet night before the battle. What if the sky had remained silent, or the general had dismissed a strange dream as mere nerves? Without that compelling vision, Constantine the pragmatist would have led his troops under the familiar eagles and standards of Rome. The battle would have been a straightforward military engagement, a test of tactics and troop loyalty alone. In such a scenario, the outcome is far less certain. Maxentius held a strong defensive position, controlling the bridge and the city walls. He had prepared diligently, and his forces were substantial. A Constantine without a divine mandate might have been more cautious, or his troops less fervent. It is entirely possible that, in a straight fight without the psychological weapon of a new faith, Maxentius could have prevailed, repelling the invasion and solidifying his own rule in Rome. A victory for Maxentius means the continuation of the Tetrarchy's pagan orthodoxy. The persecutions of Christians, which had waxed and waned under different emperors, likely continue as official policy, seeing the faith as a source of division and disloyalty. Without Constantine's subsequent Edict of Milan, which granted religious tolerance throughout the empire, Christianity remains a persecuted, underground movement in the West, its growth stunted and its institutional development severely hampered. The most profound shift, however, is the absence of a Christian emperor. There is no Council of Nicaea to standardize doctrine, no massive imperial funding for church construction, and no gradual merging of Roman administrative structure with ecclesiastical hierarchy. The faith's journey from a scattered set of communities to the official state religion of the Roman Empire is delayed by centuries, if it ever happens at all. This alters the entire cultural foundation of post-Roman Europe. The medieval world that eventually emerges is not built upon a synthesis of Roman order and Christian theology. The papacy does not rise to fill the power vacuum in the West. The intellectual life of the Middle Ages, so deeply shaped by monastic scribes preserving classical texts within a Christian framework, follows a different, perhaps more fragmented path. The legal systems, art, architecture, and even the calendar of the Western world are not imprinted with the same symbolic language. Constantine's vision at the Milvian Bridge was more than a personal conversion. It was a hinge upon which the spiritual identity of an entire civilization swung. By choosing to see a sign, he did not just win a battle, he invited a new force into the heart of empire, a force that would outlast the legions and reshape the map of human belief for 1,000 years to come. The cross on a shield had changed the faith of an empire, but it could not hold back the tide of nations pressing against its borders. Decades after Constantine, the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens faced a crisis of a different magnitude. Thousands of Gothic families, fleeing the terrifying advance of the Huns from the eastern steppes, had arrived at the Danube River, begging for sanctuary within the empire's boundaries. Valens saw an opportunity. He granted them entry, but under terms that quickly turned into exploitation, with local Roman officials demanding exorbitant bribes for food and even trading dog meat for Gothic children. The result was a predictable and violent revolt. The Goths, now more desperate than ever, formed a vast mobile nation, a wagon-circle fortress on the move, and began plundering the rich province of Thrace. Valens, campaigning against Persia, rushed back to deal with the threat personally. As he approached the Gothic encampment near Adrianople in the summer of 378, he received crucial news. His nephew and co-emperor in the west, Gratian, was marching to join him with fresh, veteran legions. Valens now stood at a crossroads. He could wait a few days for Gratian's reinforcements, combining their forces into an overwhelming army. Or he could attack immediately. His courtiers and generals were divided. Some urged patience, arguing that the combined imperial force would ensure a decisive, low-risk victory. Others, fueled by a toxic mix of arrogance and political jealousy, whispered that waiting would only allow Gratian to share in a glory that should belong to Valens alone. They dismissed the Goths as a disorganized rabble, no match for the disciplined Roman line. Valens, perhaps stung by earlier criticisms of his military record, chose to listen to the voices of impatience. He gave the order to advance. The day was blisteringly hot. The Roman troops, having marched for hours in full armor under the sun, arrived at the Gothic position exhausted and parched. The Goths had drawn their wagons into a massive defensive circle on a hill. Instead of the disorderly mob the Roman scouts had described, the defenders were a cohesive force of hardened warriors, reinforced by a large contingent of Gothic cavalry that was away foraging. As the weary Roman legions began to deploy for their assault, that cavalry returned. They did not hit the Roman front. Instead, they swept around the flank in a thundering charge, crashing into the Roman left wing and pinning the entire army against the wagon fort. The battle disintegrated into a close-quarters slaughter under the oppressive heat. The Roman formation collapsed inward. Valens himself was lost, his body never recovered. Two-thirds of the Eastern Roman field army lay dead on the field, a military catastrophe from which the empire would never fully recover. The gates to the Balkans were now broken open. But let us hold that moment of decision in the imperial tent. What if Valens had swallowed his pride and waited? For just 3 more days, Gratian's army arrives. The combined Roman force, perhaps 40,000 strong and well-rested, now faces the Gothic wagon circle. The tactical picture changes completely. With superior numbers, the Romans can fully surround the Gothic position, negating the impact of any returning cavalry. They can construct proper siege works, cut off the Goths from water, and use their artillery. A patient, methodical assault, or even the mere threat of one, forces a different outcome. The Gothic chieftains, seeing the full might of both imperial armies arrayed against them, have little choice but to negotiate a surrender from a position of profound weakness. The terms would be harsh but structured. The Goths are disarmed, broken into smaller groups, and settled on marginal lands as a source of military manpower for the empire, a process Rome had managed successfully with other tribes for centuries. They become foederati, controlled allies, their fighting strength harnessed for the empire's defense rather than turned against its heart. A Roman victory at Adrianople fundamentally resets the frontier. The Danube line is stabilized and reinforced with these new Gothic auxiliary troops. The psychological blow of the disaster, which in our history emboldened every neighboring tribe to test Roman weakness, never lands. The precedent is not one of barbarian triumph, but of Roman resilience. Most importantly, the domino effect that follows the actual battle is halted. The Western Roman Empire, already strained, is not forced to absorb wave after wave of unassimilated, armed tribal groups crossing a shattered frontier. The political and military collapse that culminated in the sack of Rome in 410 and the eventual fall of the Western Empire in 476 is likely postponed by decades, perhaps even a century. This extra time could have allowed for crucial internal reforms, economic recovery, and a more managed transition of power. The Battle of Adrianople was more than a defeat, it was a failure of imperial patience. In choosing immediate glory over assured strategy, Valens did not just lose an army, he unlocked the gate through which the ancient world itself would begin to slowly, irrevocably depart. The gates of Rome had not been breached by a foreign enemy for 800 years. That sacred, unthinkable line was crossed not by a sudden military onslaught, but through a slow unraveling of political trust. Alaric, leader of the Visigoths, was not a wild chieftain seeking destruction. He was a former Roman commander, a man who had served the empire and now sought a permanent, secure home for his people within its borders. For years, he had used his army as a bargaining chip, alternating between threat and negotiation, all to secure a formal treaty, land for settlement, and the title of a Roman general for himself. His ultimate target was not the city's destruction, but its leverage. He marched his people to the very walls of Rome not to sack it, but to force the hand of the emperor in Ravenna, a young, isolated ruler named Honorius. The negotiations that followed were a tragic farce. Honorius, advised by a hostile court faction, engaged in talks only to buy time for reinforcements that never came. Promises were made and then broken. At one critical moment, a treaty seemed within reach, only for Honorius to reject it at the last second, sending an insulting and dismissive counteroffer. The final betrayal came when a Roman general sent by Honorius launched a surprise attack on Alaric's camp during a truce. This act of bad faith extinguished the last hope for a diplomatic solution. To Alaric, it proved that the Roman word was worthless. With his people starving and his honor insulted, he gave the order his men had waited for. On August 24, 410, the Salarian Gate was opened, whether by treachery or despair, and the Visigoths entered Rome. The sack that followed was more methodical than mindlessly brutal, focused on stripping the city of its movable wealth, but the symbolic shockwave it sent across the ancient world was immeasurable. The eternal city had fallen, but rewind to that moment of final negotiation. What if a different advisor had reached Honorius's ear, one who understood the empire's desperate need for soldiers and the Visigoths' desire for stability? Imagine the emperor seeing the strategic necessity, agreeing to Alaric's core demands. A formal treaty is signed. The Visigoths are granted the province of Noricum, a frontier region in the Danube Valley, as their official homeland. Alaric is given the Roman military command he sought, and his warriors are enrolled as foederati, bound by treaty to defend the empire. This single act of political pragmatism transforms a roaming, existential threat into a stationary, powerful asset. The Visigothic army, now loyal to Rome and with a stake in its survival, becomes a bulwark on the critical Danube frontier. They provide the Western Empire with a fresh infusion of battle-hardened troops at a time when its own legions were stretched perilously thin. This new strength could have been deployed to secure other crumbling borders in Gaul and Britain, or to decisively check the ambitions of other tribal groups before they could gather momentum. With the Visigothic question settled, the political capital and military resources wasted in a decade of futile maneuvering against Alaric are instead directed inward, toward economic stabilization and administrative reform. The psychological impact is just as crucial. The sack of Rome, that profound trauma that shattered the empire's aura of invincibility and emboldened every other challenger, never happens. The precedent remains that barbarian leaders can be brought into the Roman system, not as conquerors but as partners in its defense. This could have created a viable model for managing the other migratory peoples pressing against the frontiers, integrating them piecemeal rather than being overwhelmed by them en masse. The Western Roman Empire, in this timeline, buys itself not just years but potentially several more decades of functional life. It enters the 5th century not in a death spiral, but in a tense, managed coexistence with its new Germanic allies. This extended lease on existence allows for a more orderly transition of power, a slower blending of cultures, and perhaps even the survival of a rump Roman state in Italy long after our history saw its final emperor deposed. The fate of the West was not sealed by the sword alone, but in the council chambers of Ravenna, where a young emperor's choice between pride and pragmatism determined whether the empire's greatest enemy would remain outside the gates or be invited inside to help guard them. The gates of Rome had fallen, but in the east, a new empire was learning the cost of overconfidence on a different, sun-scorched field. Emperor Heraclius had just achieved the impossible, reclaiming Jerusalem from the Persians in a war that had drained both empires to their core. As he returned to Constantinople, he believed he had secured the Byzantine frontier for a generation. He could not have foreseen the storm gathering in the Arabian desert, a unified force driven by a powerful new faith. The armies of the Rashidun Caliphate, under the command of Khalid ibn al-Walid, moved with a speed and purpose that defied Byzantine understanding. By the year 636, they had swept through the Syrian frontier, and Heraclius dispatched a massive army to crush them once and for all. The two forces met at the Yarmouk River, a valley that would become a funnel for history. For 5 grueling days, the battle raged back and forth, a brutal stalemate between the disciplined Byzantine heavy infantry and cataphracts and the highly mobile, fervently motivated Muslim troops. The Byzantines held the high ground, their flanks secured by steep ravines. Khalid's strategy was one of elastic defense, absorbing charges and then counterattacking with precise, localized strikes. On the sixth day, the Byzantine commander Vahan decided to end it. He ordered a massive, coordinated cavalry charge from both wings, aiming to envelop and crush the Muslim center. It was a sound plan, a classic hammer and anvil maneuver, but in the swirling dust and noise of battle, communication broke down. A critical contingent of Byzantine cavalry, perhaps confused by signals or drawn off by a feigned retreat, was misdirected. Instead of closing the trap, they wheeled away from the main fight, pursuing a smaller enemy force toward the camp. In that moment, a fatal gap opened in the Byzantine line. Khalid, a master of reading the battlefield, saw the seam instantly. He threw his own mobile guard into the breach, a wedge that split the Byzantine army in two. The tightly packed formations, now separated and attacked from the side and rear, collapsed into a panicked rout. The retreat became a massacre as thousands of Byzantine soldiers were driven over the steep cliffs of the Wadi al-Rakad ravine. The army of Heraclius was annihilated. Syria lay undefended, and within a few years the heart of the Byzantine Near East was lost. But let us freeze that instant before the cavalry veered off course. What if the orders had been clear, the discipline unwavering? Imagine the full weight of the Byzantine heavy cavalry striking home as intended, a rolling tide of armored men and horses crashing into the flanks of the Muslim infantry. Under that immense pressure, even the most steadfast line would have buckled. The Muslim army, surrounded and compressed, would have faced destruction or surrender. A decisive Byzantine victory at Yarmouk would have shattered the momentum of the early Muslim conquests. Khalid ibn al-Walid, a commander of legendary status, might have fallen or been captured. The Caliphate's first major expedition beyond Arabia would have ended in disaster, a devastating check to its confidence and resources. Emperor Heraclius, the restorer of the cross, would have been hailed as the savior of Christendom a second time. The immediate consequence is the preservation of the Byzantine Near East. The vital provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt remain under the control of Constantinople. The rich agricultural lands and trade routes of the Levant continue to fuel the Byzantine economy and serve as a cultural buffer between the Greek Christian world and the East. This alters the religious landscape of the entire region. Without the rapid Arab conquest, the process of linguistic and cultural Arabization and the spread of Islam across North Africa and the Levant is halted, or at least dramatically slowed. The demographic and religious map we know today, shaped by over a millennium of Islamic history, looks profoundly different. Christianity remains the dominant faith from the Aegean Sea to the Nile, though likely divided between the Chalcedonian Orthodoxy of Constantinople and the various Miaphysite churches of Syria and Egypt. The later Crusades, a response to Muslim control of the Holy Land, never have a reason to occur. The intellectual flourishing of the Islamic Golden Age, which drew upon Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge, might still happen, but in a different context, perhaps through trade and scholarly exchange rather than within a unified imperial framework. The Battle of Yarmouk was not merely a military defeat, it was a historical hinge. The misdirection of a single cavalry charge decided whether the legacy of Rome would continue to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean, or whether a new spiritual and political force would rise to reshape the world from Damascus to the Atlas Mountains. The same desert winds that carried the dust of Yarmouk would soon howl across the plains of Mesopotamia, where a second empire awaited its fate. While the Byzantines reeled in the west, the mighty Sasanian Empire of Persia, exhausted from its long war with Constantinople, now faced the unified Arab forces alone. The decisive clash came at al-Qadisiyyah in the year 636. The Sasanians fielded a magnificent army, the pride of a centuries-old imperial tradition. At its heart were the legendary cataphracts, cavalry where both rider and horse were sheathed in interlocking scales of iron. a moving wall of metal designed to shatter any infantry line through sheer, unstoppable mass. Facing them, the Muslim army relied not on heavy armor but on deep faith, disciplined formations, and a mobility born of the desert. For 3 days, the battle surged back and forth, a brutal test of endurance. Then, on the final day, the environment itself seemed to intervene. A fierce sandstorm known as a haboob swept across the battlefield from the west directly into the faces of the Sasanian troops. In the blinding, choking swirl of dust, coordination broke down. The Persian elephants, a key part of their battle array, panicked and stampeded back into their own lines. It was in this moment of chaos that the cataphracts made their fateful charge. Their thunderous advance, meant to be the final hammer blow, lost its cohesion in the storm. The Muslim infantry, their backs to the wind, held their disciplined squares, their long spears braced against the earth. The legendary charge, disorganized and blinded, broke upon those anchored lines like a wave against stone. The cataphracts were pulled from their horses, and the heart of the Sasanian army was torn out. The defeat was total, opening the gates of the Persian heartland to conquest. But what if the wind had shifted or the storm had never risen? Imagine that final charge unfolding under a clear sky. The cataphracts, a gleaming tide of iron, maintained their perfect formation. Their momentum is unchecked, a concentrated force of destruction hitting the Muslim center with its full, terrifying weight. Even the most steadfast infantry square has its breaking point. Under the impact of tons of armored horseflesh and lance, the line buckles, then shatters. A rout begins, spreading panic through the entire Arab army. The Muslim force is not just defeated, it is hunted down and destroyed on the open plain. The consequence of such a victory is a world remade. The Sasanian Empire, having annihilated the Caliphate's primary eastern army, preserves its ancient throne at Ctesiphon. The Zoroastrian faith, the state religion of Persia for a millennium, does not recede under the pressure of a new monotheistic wave. Instead, it continues as the spiritual core of a major world power, a vibrant counterweight to both Byzantium and any future powers rising from Arabia. The eastern expansion of Islam is decisively blocked at the Mesopotamian frontier. This changes the cultural and linguistic destiny of an entire region. Without the Arab conquest, the Persian language evolves without the massive infusion of Arabic script and vocabulary that came with the Quran. It likely retains its older Pahlavi script, and its literary renaissance happens within a different Zoroastrian or perhaps later Buddhist or Manichaean framework. The profound fusion of Persian administrative genius with Islamic civilization that produced the golden age of the Abbasid Caliphate simply never occurs, because that caliphate never expands beyond the Arabian Peninsula. Central Asia, a crossroads of cultures, remains a zone of competition between Persian, Turkic, and Chinese influences, rather than becoming a thoroughfare for the spread of Islam eastward. The rich intellectual traditions of cities like Bukhara and Samarkand develop along a completely different axis, perhaps drawing more heavily from Indian Buddhism or Chinese thought. The Battle of al-Qadisiyyah was a collision of two military doctrines, but it was the desert wind that tipped the scales. In the calm of a different day, the legacy of Cyrus and Darius might have endured, leaving a Zoroastrian Persia as a permanent pillar of the ancient world, its fired temples still casting light on a history that chose a different path. The desert winds that decided the fate of empires were far removed from the lush, ordered valleys of 8th century China. Here, under the brilliant Tang dynasty, the world reached a peak of cosmopolitan splendor. The capital, Chang'an, was the largest city on earth, a marvel of planning where Persian merchants, Korean scholars, and Central Asian musicians mingled under the benevolent gaze of the Son of Heaven. The Silk Road thrived, a golden artery of commerce and ideas flowing into the heart of a confident empire. This zenith was shattered not by a foreign invasion but by a trusted sword. An Lushan, a military governor of immense power and personal favor with the emperor, turned his vast armies against the dynasty in the year 755. His rebellion was a volcano erupting at the empire's core, and its lava flow seemed unstoppable as it surged toward the twin capitals, Luoyang and Chang'an. The only barrier left was the formidable Tang Pass, a narrow, fortified gateway through the mountains that protected the western approach to Chang'an. Holding it was the empire's last, best hope. The defender was General Jeshu Han, a seasoned but aging commander loyal to the throne. His position was one of immense strength. The pass was a natural bottleneck, easily defended by a smaller force against a larger one. His strategy was sound and simple: fortify, hold, and wait. Time was on the dynasty's side. Every day the rebellion was contained at Tang Pass was a day for loyalist forces to gather in the rear, for supply lines to stretch thin for An Lushan, and for the rebellion's momentum to stall. But from the besieged court, now under the sway of a paranoid chancellor, came a different order. The emperor was pressured to demand a quick, decisive victory to quell panic. Jeshu Han received relentless commands: abandon the defensive plan, march out, engage the rebels in open battle. The general knew it was a catastrophic mistake. To leave the pass was to trade an unbreakable shield for a risky sword thrust against a larger, battle-hardened enemy. Yet the orders from the emperor, the son of heaven himself, were unmistakable. In that agonizing moment, Jeshu Han faced a choice between military wisdom and imperial obedience. He chose obedience. He led his elite troops out of the pass and onto the open plain. The result was a foregone conclusion to any soldier. His forces were surrounded and annihilated. The road to Chang'an now lay wide open. The emperor fled in disgrace. The glorious capital was sacked and burned, its libraries, temples, and markets consumed by flames. The rebellion would sputter on for 8 more years, but the damage was done. The central authority of the Tang was broken, replaced by warlordism. The census records tell a harrowing tale. The empire may have lost 2/3 of its registered population to warfare, famine, and displacement. The Silk Road's golden age flickered and dimmed under the chaos, but let us hold that moment at the mouth of Tang Pass. What if Jeshu Han had possessed the stubborn courage of a later dynasty's general, or the political cunning to delay? Imagine him sending back messengers explaining that a sortie is being prepared, while his men quietly deepen the trenches and reinforce the gates. He holds the line not for days but for weeks. This single act of strategic defiance changes everything. Contained at the mountains, An Lushan's rebellion becomes a regional crisis, not an existential one. The Tang court remains in Chang'an, a symbol of unbroken authority. Loyalist armies from other provinces converge, cutting off the rebels from their bases. Without the psychological victory of capturing the capital, the rebellion likely fractures, its momentum bleeding away against the stone of Tang Pass. A contained rebellion means the unimaginable loss of life is averted. The cultural heart of Chang'an is preserved, its libraries and academies continuing to fuel innovation. Most importantly, the delicate ecosystem of the Silk Road remains under stable Tang protection. Trade continues unabated, ideas flow, and the cosmopolitan character of the dynasty endures. The shift in global history is profound. Without the catastrophic weakening of the Tang, Central Asia remains firmly within the Chinese sphere of influence for centuries longer. This potentially alters the timeline for the westward expansion of other powers, including the early Arab caliphates. The technological and cultural exports of China, from papermaking to printing, might spread even more rapidly and under different circumstances. The very concept of a unified, central Chinese state, which faced centuries of fragmentation after the Tang's true decline, could have remained the unshakable norm, preventing the era of disunion that followed. Jeshu Han's march from the gates was more than a tactical blunder. It was the moment the keeper of the door handed the key to the destroyer. In choosing to follow an order over the clear evidence of the terrain before him, He did not just lose an army, he unlocked a century of fragmentation, silencing the vibrant hum of the world's greatest city and dimming the light on a road that connected hemispheres. The glow of Chang'an's libraries had faded, but a different kind of flame would soon illuminate the banks of the Seine. As the 9th century waned, the fractured Carolingian Empire offered a tempting target for the seafaring warriors from the north. In the winter of 885, a fleet of hundreds of Viking longships carrying thousands of warriors appeared before the island citadel of Paris. Their demand was simple: passage upriver to raid the richer, undefended lands of Burgundy. The city's defender, Count Odo, gave his answer from the walls, a refusal that would trigger one of the most legendary sieges of the medieval age. Paris was not the sprawling capital it would become. Its heart was the Isle de la Cité, a fortified island in the Seine connected to the riverbanks by 2 low wooden bridges, the Grand Pont to the north and the Petit Pont to the south. These bridges were the city's lifelines and its greatest vulnerability. Odo's strategy hinged on holding them at all costs. For months, the Vikings assaulted these narrow causeways while their ships battered the island's stone ramparts. The defenders, a mix of Frankish soldiers and determined citizens, repelled charge after charge, fighting from wooden towers erected on the bridges themselves. The critical moment arrived during a furious assault on the Petit Pont. A determined Viking warband, shielded by a barrage of arrows and thrown spears, fought its way onto the wooden span. They hacked at the defenders' barricades, inching closer to the island gate. The fighting was desperate, hand-to-hand on a platform slick with winter rain and loss. According to the chronicles, the line nearly broke. Had those northern warriors pushed through that final barricade, they would have poured onto the island itself. The city's inner sanctum would have been breached. Once the Vikings secured a foothold on the Isle de la Cité, the fall of the entire city was almost certain. The churches, the treasury, the seat of what remained of royal authority, all would have been at their mercy. A full sack of Paris in 886 would have been more than a raid, it would have been a political earthquake. The Carolingian dynasty, already weakened by internal division, derived its fragile legitimacy from being the defenders of Christendom. The failure to protect one of the realm's key cities, the very place where the revered Emperor Charlemagne's grandson, Charles the Fat, was supposed to reign, would have shattered that legitimacy completely. The prestige of the crown would have evaporated overnight. In the aftermath, the already powerful regional nobles would have seen no reason to pledge allegiance to a failed king. West Francia, the embryo of modern France, would likely have shattered into a patchwork of independent counties and duchies, each making their own separate peace or war with the Viking leaders. The north, particularly the region around the Seine, could have become a permanent Norse territory, a second Normandy established not by treaty decades later, but by right of conquest. This changes the entire foundation of French history. Without a central royal figure like the later Capetians to slowly rebuild authority from Paris outward, the consolidation of a unified French kingdom might never have occurred. The political landscape of Western Europe would have been permanently balkanized, with a powerful Scandinavian polity entrenched at the heart of what was once Carolingian territory. The linguistic and cultural development of the region shifts, influenced by enduring Norse settlement and law. The feudal system, which evolved in part through the relationship between a weakening crown and powerful local lords, develops in a far more decentralized, fragmented form. The defense of that wooden bridge, therefore, was not just about saving a city, it was about preserving the faint pulse of a unified realm. Count Odo's stand, which made him a hero and later a king, held the line long enough for a semblance of royal authority to arrive, however feebly. His resistance proved that the Vikings could be denied, that a city could withstand them. That fragile victory on the Petit Pont became a foundational myth for the French monarchy, a story that whispered a kingdom could still be built if only someone had the courage to hold the bridge. 25 fragile moments, each a world in the balance, From the gates of Troy to the bridges of Paris, a single pattern emerges time and again, a pattern not of destiny but of profound human vulnerability. These were not collisions of impersonal forces, but stories decided in the breath between a thought and an action. The common thread is the human element, so often flawed. Arrogance, that toxic certainty, appears again and again. Crassus believed the desert would bow to his wealth and legions. Varus trusted a guide more than the landscape before him. The Athenian assembly, in its grief after Arginusi, chose vengeance over its own survival. In each case, an unshakable belief in one's own rightness became the very flaw that shattered the future. Then there is hesitation, the corrosive pause. Hannibal, after the masterpiece of Cannae, chose to rest his army instead of marching on Rome. Nicias in Sicily, fearing the unknown, asked for more men when speed was his only ally. Their reluctance, a moment of what seemed like prudent caution, was the opening through which victory slipped away, and woven through these decisions is betrayal, the fracture of trust. Arminius used his Roman education to lead legions to their end. The whispers in Pompey's camp turned a sound strategy into a doomed charge. The guide at Carrhae, the political pressure at Tang Pass, each represents a failure of loyalty that redirected the current of history. Yet human choices were not made in a vacuum. They intersected with the indifferent world. The environment itself became a decisive general. The sandstorm at al-Qadisiyyah blinded the Persian cataphracts, turning their legendary charge into chaos. The narrow pass at Thermopylae and the dense forest of Teutoburg negated overwhelming numbers, proving that terrain could be a more powerful ally than any army. The river at the Granicus, the desert heat at Carrhae, the muddy slopes of Marathon, these were not just backdrops, they were active participants, tilting the scales for those who understood them and destroying those who did not. And finally, there is the ghost in the machine, pure luck. The near miss of an axe at Alexander's head, the timing of a cavalry charge at Yarmouk, the direction of the wind on 100 battlefields. Cleitus's arm moved a half-second faster, and the Hellenistic world was born. A storm did not rise at Actium, and Antony sailed away. These are the moments no planner can account for, the random variables that remind us history is not a chess game, but a story written in a language of chance. What does this mosaic of near misses reveal? It shows us that the past is not a solid road leading inevitably to our present. It is a landscape of fragile equilibriums, a delicate structure where the weight of a single decision, a shift in the weather, or a stray arrow could send the entire edifice tumbling down a different path. The Roman Republic, Athenian democracy, the spread of faiths and languages, the very map of continents, all balanced on these knife edges. To study these wars is to understand that our world is not the only one that could have been, but simply the one that survived the relentless, beautiful, and terrifying contingency of it all. Our journey through these 25 fragile moments is more than a collection of ancient battles. It is a deep exploration of historical causality, the intricate web of cause and effect that shapes civilizations. By examining these points where history could have turned, we gain a profound appreciation for the narrow foundation upon which our present world is built. Every cultural tradition, every dominant language, every political border we recognize today was forged in the fires of outcomes that were far from guaranteed. They were the result of specific choices made under immense pressure, influenced by terrain, weather, human error, and sheer luck. This understanding does not diminish the past but enriches it, revealing history not as a predetermined march but as a story of immense possibility. The legacy we inherit is just one version of events, a single thread pulled from a tapestry of near infinite complexity, so we leave you with a final reflection. Of all the crossroads we have explored, from the wooden horse to the Viking bridge, which alternative path do you find most compelling to consider? Which fragile moment, had it tipped the other way, would have created a world most unrecognizable to our own? The conversation about history's great what-ifs is a gateway to deeper curiosity. a way to engage with the past not as a static record, but as a living landscape of human drama and consequence. We invite you to continue that exploration, to question the stories we think we know, and to discover the countless other hinges upon which our collective story has turned.